Well, good morning, Ian, and good morning, Malcolm.
Good morning.
It's lovely to.
Grateful to you for doing so.
Me
I've
too.
already had a number of
So,
mental conversations with Iain, so it's nice to have an actual one.
yes, and I've lived with Malcolm while I was reading Coleridge the Mariner, but yes, and I'm an admirer of his poems too. So
Well,
it's lovely to meet at last.
Yes, indeed.
indeed. Well, having had one conversation previously with Ian and many with Malcolm, I kind of realized there were quite a lot of overlapping interests. But what really sort of sparked the idea of having this conversation was hearing Malcolm talking about a very early, I think, poem of C.S. Lewis, which I'd never come across before, but seemed to just have so many sort of Mcgilchrist themes avant la lettre that it just seemed to be a very nice way into the conversation. So I don't know, perhaps Malcolm, you could start us off by just telling us about the poem and
Right, yeah. Oh, I'm very happy. So the poem was not published in Lewis's lifetime, surprisingly, because it's a very good poem, but he was disheartened by poor reviews and very poor sales of his only two purely poetry books in his lifetime. So he kind of wrote rather more secretly after that. And the poem was published posthumously in an edition put together quite hastily by Walter Hooper. And Walter Hooper, it turns out, titled the poem Reason. The more I read the poem, and the poem is about the balance or the imbalance. It's about the dilemma Lewis feels in mediating between his two capacities of imagination and reason. And it's a poem is seeking for a reconciler. I thought it couldn't be called Reason because he wouldn't have called it Reason because it would immediately upset the balance, the very question he's asking, to title it either Reason or Imagination. In fact, if I were to give it a title, I would call it Who, but there it was, printed in print, it said Reason. But I became so convinced that he couldn't have called it this that I actually managed to get in touch with Walter Hooper and ask him what had been in the autographed manuscript. And he said, no, there hadn't been a title, but he felt the need to assign it. And because Reason was written in capital letters, he thought, well, I'll call it Reason. In the new scholarly edition by Don King, it's without title, because of the arguments I put forth. So, Iain, I think you already knew or know of the wonderful passage in Surprised by Joy, which is, of course, a much later book, when Lewis looks back to his time in the 1920s, really, as a young don in Cambridge before his conversion. And you may remember he famously says, the two hemispheres of my mind, a phrase for you, the two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of myth and poetry. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly everything I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly everything I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. And of course, biographers of Lewis and historians of the time might reasonably object that that book was written many years after the state of mind he describes and after his conversion. And so you might want to have an earlier record penned in those years about how he felt. And I have become persuaded that this poem is exactly that. Just because it seemed to be so much on the cusp of an answer to the question or a conversion, I was thinking it might be in the late 1920s, maybe 28 or 29. Alistair McGrath actually thinks it might be earlier still, in which case, if it was 26 or so, then he was living with the question he asks in this poem for about 5 years before he attained some kind of answer and reconciliation. So I'll read you the poem. It's a glorious extended metaphor. It's a sort of extended sonnet too, 16-liner, in which Lewis imagines his soul as though it were the ancient city, or anybody's soul, as though it were the ancient city of Athens. And he thinks about the two kinds of Greek religion, as it were. He thinks about the pure and beautiful exactitudes and the kind of geometric perfections of the Parthenon on the one hand. And then I think he thinks about the fertility rites and the mysteries down in the caves. And he uses these two as metaphors for the faculties of reason and imagination. So here's the poem without further ado. It's, I think, one of his very best. Set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. And he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white. So clear is reason. But how dark imagining, warm, dark, obscure and infinite, daughter of night. Dark is her brow. The beauty of her eyes with sleep is loaded, and her pains are long, and her delight. Tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. Oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then could I truly say and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe. So I'd be really interested to know what you think of that poem, Iain, or any comments, first responses to it.
Yes. Well, as to the remarks about hemispheres, of course, a chill enters into my blood whenever I hear somebody from fairly remote time talking about hemispheres, because in order to say what I wanted to say about them, I had to sort of jettison most of the baggage that they carried with them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think that there is a long history of people seeing that there are two fundamental ways in which we seem to approach the world, and these have been sometimes cast, as famously Nietzsche cast them, as the Apollonian and the Dionysian,
Yes,
which is really more or less what we're hearing there. Although I like the Demeter rather than Dionysius, actually.
Yeah, in fact, I like the fact that they're both goddesses.
Yes, I do too.
Say to people who have a rather parody version of Lewis as some curmudgeonly old repressed, probably misogynist don who couldn't understand women, and I say, well, look, here's somebody saying he's taking the two greatest powers of his inner life and figuring them both in as goddesses. I mean, I summed up this poem to a young student once as saying, basically, here's a guy saying, I can't get my inner goddesses together. But I'm glad you like Demeter. I'm aware of the Apollonian and Dionysian distinction.
Yes.
So it's a good way of thinking about poetry. But I think the Athene Demeter adds nuance.
Yes. Well, it does, and also what's good is that Dionysus is mainly famous for, or Dionysus is mainly famous for being drunk, whereas Demeter is mainly known for being that fertile seed bed in which things grow, as it were. So altogether, I like that. And one of the things I've discovered in writing, particularly The Matter with Things, the book that came out last year, is how much people in all cultures have sensed that there are two powers, if you like, inside them, or two modes of being, which are at conflict with one another, or can be. And you find this in China, you find it in Japan, you find it in India, you find it in the North American native peoples' legends. In fact, there's one particularly staggering one there from the Onondaga people, who long before anyone knew anything at all about the differences between the hemispheres, describes very, very well, better than anybody that I know, in the pre-scientific era, the differences between the hemispheres. And I spent half a dozen pages unpacking that. So I think that this intuition people have, an inward sense that their mind is not single, but has these at least two principal modes of operation that need to cooperate. Both are necessary, but one is more important than the other.
Yes, it's the both a necessary thing, I think, is really important. Lewis is not playing here for a triumph of one over the other, but for a reconciliation. And I love the way in this, although he uses the two images of, the virgin goddess and the mother goddess, and he then maps it onto the senses as well. So you have intellectual sight and you have imagination, dim exploring touch. And then you have the dimensional thing as well. You have the imagination as kind of, below, somehow kind of woming, fertile dark, and you have the reason above with the sort of clarity of the night sky.
Yes.
So he's got a whole series of contrasting things, but all of which are mutual, in some way.
Yes.
I mean, I think there's there's a distinctively Christian element to this, even though Lewis is not a Christian at that point, because the language of the depth and height, the language of reconciliation, even the language of reconciling maid and mother, all point to a lot of things that could be said about the idea of incarnation and the transcendent becoming the immanent, and even Mary as both maid and mother. So I think there are distinctive things there. But I think the general contrasts, but the need for reconciliation are really good. What troubles me sometimes? No, go on.
No. Even the idea that reason and imagination are necessarily at loggerheads is a mistake in my view, because I would make a distinction between the purely rationalizing faculty that in effect a computer could carry out, and what is meant by a much bigger and broader and deeper idea, that of reason, which is a bringing together of one's ability to think in rational terms with all that one learns from experience and that comes from one's emotional, embodied and spiritual life.
Yes, I think that's a very helpful distinction, because reason is sometimes used as though it meant mere ratiocination or following a logical procedure.
Yes.
Whereas certainly in the kind of text that I read, when I was doing my doctorate on the sermons of John Donne and Lancelot Andrewes, for example, so you're looking at very thoughtful prose from the late 16th and early 17th century, they used reason with a capital R in a far more inclusive way than we would. And they obviously clearly intended to include reflection on experience and some of what we would call intuition, a kind of. So I think there's to just develop Lewis, just one last point on him. Obviously, he thought about these things for a very long time. And I think he put one of the things that came to him after the dilemma, in a sense, the dilemma expressed in this was partly resolved by his coming to faith. But much later, in a purely literary critical essay about understanding literature, a very oddly titled essay called Blusspels and Flallenspheres, two completely made up words of Lewis's. He has this to say. He says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. And
that's I like that. Partly because in this, the matter with things falls into three parts. The first part is neuroscience, establishing the differences between the hemispheres. The second part is epistemology. And in that, I reckon that probably there are four main paths that people would consider might lead them to truths, but they're quite, they sound rather different from one another: science, reason, intuition and imagination. And what I suggest is that imagination is on a different level from the other three, and that actually each of the other three depends, well, they all depend on one another, in fact, and that the best way to approach anything is to use as many of these as one can, but that all three of science, reason and intuition depend enormously on imagination. Imagination is not really on the same level as them, but something so deep and so important that it alone brings us insight and understanding, including in science and including in reason.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, I'm so glad to hear that. I really agree with that. First of all, I think Coleridge famously said it's the philosopher's privilege to distinguish, but not to divide. And so I think when we distinguish these things, we're not saying they're not mutually interwoven. But I completely agree that imagination underlies a great deal of science and other supposedly non-imaginative things. Tom McLeish is somebody who's been writing about that.
Yeah.
I think
incredibly. I love the phrase in Lewis of the dim imagination's dim exploring touch, which I think just captures very nicely the way that actually imagination kind of reaches into things that you can't get in any other way. And I mean, Malcolm, you talk rather in there's that lovely passage at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, where Theseus is talking about imagination, and it's a it's such a delightful place, partly because he talks about these. I mean, these sort of the legendary sort of creatures talking about things, whereas he himself is.
Yeah. Oh no, that's. I mean, obviously, it's an early play of Shakespeare's. It's a delightfully playful play. And of course, it's a comedy, and it's therefore about. It has to end with marriages. And he kind of maps out some of these very pairings that we're thinking about that might be described in polar terms as almost opposites, but are actually, there must be some current of meaning flowing mutually between them as there are between the poles of a magnet. And so you have, on the one hand, Oberon and Titania quarreling, and you have Theseus and Hippolyta who have been at war, and their marriage is now to be a peace. She's the Amazon queen. And to some degree, Theseus tries to set himself up as the plain. I mean, he happens to be a mythical Duke of Athens, but he sets himself up in the play as a plain, blunt-speaking, rather pragmatic Englishman. And yet Shakespeare puts into the mouth of a hostile witness, as it were, deliberately puts into his mouth the best account I think we have of the poetic imagination. So that's a wonderful scene. It's the beginning of Act 5. And of course, all the lovely plays and interplays and combinations and recombinations of all the possible ones are worked through of who's in love with whom out in the magic of the woods. But when they come back to the daylight court, as it were, of nice rational Athens, the lovers, through their midnight exploits with Puck and all the rest, have now been rightly sorted. They're ready to be happily married. But Theseus and Hippolyta don't see that. They're off stage during all that time. So Act 5 comes on this wonderful thing where they've obviously been told off stage what all these adventures were. And we, the audience, within the play, we know it happened, but they have to take it on trust. And, Hippolyta says, "Oh, 'tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of." And Theseus starts off with this, "I don't believe this kind of thing." He says, "More strange than true. I never may believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact, And he dismisses the lunatic and the lover in a couple of lines, the madman sees more devils than vast hell can hold, The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt, which actually, in terms of the play, is that like, you really want to say you're in a hole, Theseus, stop digging. If you're with your fiance on the night before a wedding and you say, "Oh, well, people fall in love, but it's all, girl's probably ugly, it's just a brief fit there." You don't go there, Theseus. But anyway, then when he comes onto the poet, it suddenly expands. And he's talking about these lovers and madmen have such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. Very interesting. That's the first apprehend, comprehend. Then comes the description of the poet. That famously, the poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, I think that's just a glorious description of the imaginative arts. I love the fact that you get this from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. I mean, in one sense, greedily saying earth and heaven means everything. But since he's already said apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends, and immediately afterwards he's going to say, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. I can't help feeling that heaven and earth also are invisible, visible, apprehend, comprehend. That there's, I mean, T.S. Eliot famously said that poetry is peripheral vision, that it's about the thing that is just in the offing that you can't quite see. And of course, if you turn and focus on it, it disappears. But Eliot thought the poet could stay sufficiently still as to woo the peripheral into the
Yes.
and give it voice. So as I understand this, having done heaven, earth, heaven, what Shakespeare says is the imagination, which apprehends, then creates a body, a kind of imagined but visible thing, imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. So something which is not yet accessible to the reason or to comprehension is given a model or a shape or a suggestion, which becomes, as he calls it, a habitation. Now, a habitation is not a kind of thick square thing that you can't get into. Obviously, it has doors and windows, and you go into a habitation to visit somebody. And lots of people have the experience with really great works of art, pieces of music, paintings, or poems, or plays for that matter, that, as it were, it's a finite thing. You know how many lines there are in the play, and you know the scene. You know, you walk into the same thing every time, but it's like going into a house and finding there are new guests or people you didn't know come out from one of the back rooms. You meet inside the habitation of the work of art all kinds of things which now you can get to know a little bit better. Truths, in fact, that you can get to know a bit better because they've been sort of wooed into some kind of imaged and knowable being, and the meaning is brought forth. So, I mean, that's interestingly,
Yes.
thesis is supposed to be logical, has a slight logical slip there, because he says it embodies forth the form of things unknown, and later he uses the term airy nothing as if it were the same as unknown, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. But of course, just because something is unknown doesn't mean it's airy nothing. And in fact,
No.
I think it's precisely the imaginative art, whether it's somebody suddenly coming up with a complete new model of the cosmos and reconfiguring the observations to see if they fit, or Shakespeare creating a character. There's a what's there. It was previously unknown, but is now knowable.
Yes. The value of being unknowable in the sense of fully known or directly known is terrifically important. And I started out my migration from being a student of philosophy and literature to being a doctor with some reflections in an early book against criticism on why things need to remain implicit, that when they're dragged into the focus of our attention, they're decontextualized, disembodied, and they change their nature completely.
Yeah.
So this idea that Roger was putting forward of, I think he was quoting from Lewis, this, what did you call it? This dim grasping.
The imagination's dim exploring touch.
Yes, that struck me. A number of things that were said struck me as quite specific for the right hemisphere. Interestingly, when the left hemisphere is liberated from any control of the right hemisphere, it grasps, or as I use the word apprehend, which literally means to grapple onto something, whereas the right hemisphere's hand, the left hand, when it's liberated, explores. It gently explores the space rather than grasping onto something. Now, that gentle, dim exploration seems to me exactly what the imagination does and where the riches of imagination lie. And when you said, Malcolm, about Eliot and the peripheral vision, and I remember that, I was thinking how it is the right hemisphere that has peripheral vision. The left hemisphere has a vision of the center of the field only, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
And also, of course, Eliot said this marvelous thing that in the poem, the meaning is the meat that the burglar tosses to the dog while he burgles the house. In other words, the dark stuff goes on while the focal mind is captured by this piece of meat, the meaning. So I think that we need to sort of occupy the grasping mind, what I call the apprehending mind. We need to give that something to play with and be out of the way, while the comprehending mind, the right hemisphere, is able to put together the whole picture. And I prefer comprehension for that, because you can grasp onto something without comprehending it, but comprehension means that you really understand it. And its root is not grappling onto, but pulling together or grasping together. And so that is that's the way I would look at those phrases.
No, I totally get the way you're using there. I mean, I think the way, because of the contrast between imagination apprehending and cool reason comprehending in the Shakespeare, I used.
But it doesn't matter, just different terms.
Apprehend, that gives get hold of. I mean, like monkeys having prehensile tails. And I was using that as you can get a little bit of it, but not all of it. whereas
Yes,
comprehend is
yes.
the ability to bring your mind around it. And what I was
Yes, yes, I see that.
what we
Yes,
need is a movement from the one to the other. I agree with you. I
that's
think
it.
if you have only the left brain, as it were, without the right brain's comprehensiveness and intuition, then you not only you may get some very precise figures, but you get a false reading of the whole thing.
Well, yes, I've demonstrated that the left hemisphere is actually deluded on its own. And I mean that technically. I don't mean that it's just
Yeah.
a little bit off. It actually believes just the sort of thing that people with severe mental illness and brain injuries are deceived by. So it is
I
actually
think that's really
utterly unreliable on its own, and requires the right hemisphere to help it understand, comprehend the whole picture.
I think that's a really important thing to know, and it's interesting to know its physiological basis as well. I mean, one of the things I argue in my other book, Faith, Hope and Poetry, Theology and the Poetic Imagination, is, and more recently in a book called Lifting the Veil, Imagination, the Kingdom of God, I contend that insofar as there has been a dominance of what you've mapped as left brain thinking since the Enlightenment, that we've constructed, as it were, a purely reductive, atomized material view of the world, the kind of thing that Mary Midgley talks about as well, in this sort of atomizing sense. And that we take that for truth, but it is actually a delusion. I mean, the construct of the world as consisting only of quantity and not quality and devoid of meaning is a false construct.
Absolutely.
It's not the case. And the continuous witness of poets, of the imaginative arts, of indigenous peoples, to another way of seeing the world, which shows you that we have a narrow gap. So I think we're living in exciting times. I think your work, and in some ways the work of Owen Barfield, although he's gone now, his essays like The Coming Trauma of Materialism. I think the purely atomizing, as it were, utterly immanent frame material construct that was taken as a consensus, I think it's actually breaking up on every side, and people are really we're at a kind of crisis moment in terms of worldview, where there's a possibility for really big creative breakthroughs, and for somebody, some scientists and others, to start reimagining in the deepest sense of the word, a picture of the world which is more holistic, which doesn't exclude the spiritual dimension. I think that's a really, and I don't think that's just on the part of people like me who believe in a particular faith, but I think it's a wider thing. People of all faith and none are finally finding, if you like, the purely empiricist view simply inadequate to reality. It's not. It doesn't, as Aristotle would say, "Satsai phenomena." It doesn't save the appearances.
No. Well, I think everyone has come to feel the bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy, the intellectual bankruptcy, the spiritual bankruptcy of the idea of reductive materialism. And oddly enough, the inanimate sciences, physics in particular, got way beyond this 100 years ago, but we've been held back by biologists who've nonetheless stuck with a mid-Victorian hydraulic version of the universe. But I now see that many important figures in the biological sciences can see how this simply won't do anymore, and they're moving on in a very exciting way. So I agree with that. What I wouldn't want to do for anything to do would be to suggest that I had any brief for those who want to discard either reason or science. They are enormously important handmaidens, but they should always be in service to the imagination.
I think that's exactly what Lewis is saying in that early poem, Reason. When he says that on the Soul's Acropolis, the Reason stands, when he says, "He who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear as reason." I think one of the things he's trying to say is, if 2 and 2 actually is 4, then you can't pretend it's 5 if it would be convenient for you to do so. That we can have no truck with my truth, and or that awful phrase heard during a Trump briefing in the early days of his presidency, when they said these are alternative facts.
Yes.
I mean, I think I think Reason has to be put back into a place of integration with all our other means of knowing.
Yes.
Ecosynthesis. But I don't think,
I think
that means that we can simply deny things that we know to be true because they're inconvenient.
Yes.
I think
It's interesting.
academia is at risk of being really destroyed by people saying, well, my truth is this and it's just as good as yours. No, there have to be standards for what we accept as truth, and they involve not being uncritical of science and not realizing that there are things that go beyond reason, because there are things that are beyond both science and reason, but nonetheless to respect them very deeply. Sorry, Roger, you wanted to say something, I think.
Just sort of going back to the Shakespeare passage where, I mean, the end of his speech, sort of Theseus talks about, imagining how easy in the night, imagining some fear, how easy is the bush supposed to bear, that actually imagination can indeed, mislead you. But then Hippolyta comes in and says this, that talks about the
all the story of the night told o'er.
Yes, it grows to some great constancy when actually different things come together, that the fancy's images grows to something of great constancy. And it's actually this
great grows is a beautiful word there, because that lovely thing, all the he says, all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesseth than fancy's images, and grows to something of great constancy, although howsoever strange and admirable. And I think that grows is really beautiful. I think Hippolyta is saying there is that at first what the lovers said off stage seemed incredible, but then they backed each other up. There was more than one witness. There was something transfiguring happening, and that what has happened to them is a process of change and growth which bears its own fruit, and it grows to something of great constancy. And I think, again, because I think all of this is partly Shakespeare looking out at his audience and say, let me show you what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. I'm trying to transfigure all your minds together. And although you know, and I know that you know that I've made this up at one level, Coleridge would say you've willingly suspended that willing suspension of disbelief, which for the moment constitutes poetic faith, in his beautiful phrase. Nevertheless, I'm going to give you something which grows to constancy, which holds water, and which therefore is a useful vehicle for you to know yourselves and the world.
Yes.
And he revisited this at the end of his life in The Tempest with
absolutely.
I think a much deeper exploration, but then he was an older and wiser man.
Oh yeah. Yes, in my Faith Open Poetry, in the second chapter, I basically begin the chapter with A Midsummer Night's Dream and end it with The Tempest.
Right.
There's a revisiting of that precisely.
Yes.
And he recognizes the limitations. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. Our little life is round with a sleep. But
yes.
It's an astonishing exploration of both the use and abuse of the imaginative faculties. Prospero is by no means an unambiguous figure. Certainly not seen.
Exactly, but then it wouldn't be the great work it is if he were not ambiguous, because ambiguity, if you like, is at the base of all this. It's the base of the poetic art. Not for nothing did that precocious young man William Empson write
I was about
7
to
types.
Have you seen it argued? I think Jonathan Bate argues this in one of his books on Shakespeare, talking about Empson's amazing readings of Shakespeare's sonnets. He's got a chapter called Quantum Shakespeare, and what he says is that Empson, as a brilliant young man, was probably the only person from the English faculty who went to the original lectures of Rutherford & Co. on quantum, and that he knew what was going on. He knew that double state, both wave and particle, and not knowing which it would be and when the wave function would, that he had learned that, and that was what gave him license in his literary criticism to notice and value ambiguity, rather than trying to resolve it into one particle of meaning or another particle of meaning, which is what all the previous critics had done. But to stay with the ambiguity and say, that's the meaning, this is coming to you as a wave, and it's not to a particle.
Well, he was, I think, a brilliant mind, and as well as a very interesting poet, wasn't he,
Oh yeah.
Empson? But I mean, two of his great interests were, in fact, physics and Chinese culture. And in both of these, we see the things that sound to us impossible, paradoxical, are held to be possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no, I'm very glad you mentioned him, because I think one of the things I most valued about my own training in literary criticism as an undergraduate in Cambridge, I was fortunate to sit at the feet of Christopher Ricks and others who were, in a sense, disciples of Empson, and so that Empsonian capacity to hold two things in tension together and not feel that
Yes.
we had to conquer the other.
Yes,
Was an
yes.
essential
No, that's
part of
right.
understanding of what poetry is and how it works.
Yes. Coleridge had Coleridge was the first person in the West that I know who stated so clearly certain very important ideas. One you've already mentioned, which is that one can distinguish without dividing. And unfortunately nowadays we assume that because I've made a distinction that I mean a division, but I don't. One can distinguish the north and south pole of a magnet, but they both require one another, and there isn't a hard and fast place where one becomes the other.
Yes,
So,
that's why Coleridge attempted to develop what he called polar logic, which I think he
yes,
also took from some earlier thinkers, but precisely
yes,
that polarity, that there is a field, there is, as it were, a semantic field of meaning operated
yes,
between the poles, which is what, as it were, organizes the filings of one.
yes.
The
And you
other
can
thing,
probably remember the exact words, but I can't. But he says that, you know, that the faculty of reason allows us to distinguish without dividing, but then the next stage is to recompose a whole, to allow things to go back into their union. And this is very important in my philosophy, because I believe that, in fact, this is the way the hemispheres relate, that the right hemisphere has, if you like, a first grasp of the whole. The left hemisphere then analyzes, breaks up, categorizes, spots a theoretical structure. But that is all fine as long as it's then taken back and up again into a whole in which that sharpness is no longer the only truth. So it's resolved into something greater. But unfortunately, in much of our thinking these days, we stop at the fragmentation, at the analytic stage, and say, well, there we have it. But no, you're only in the intermediate stage. Now you need to take that information that you found by this left hemisphere process back into making a new gestalt, a new whole vision.
Yes, I think Coleridge's other distinction between imagination and fancy is very helpful there.
Oh, it's so important,
you know,
and one I often refer to.
All the fancy can do is play with what Coleridge in that passage calls fixities and definites.
That's right.
But the great power of the imagination, the secondary imagination, is synthesizing, is perceiving the relations of the parts, you know.
And in a passage in Biographia Literaria where he makes the distinction between imagination and fancy particularly clear, he makes 8 different characteristics on which they can be distinguished from one another, and every single one of them is a way that also the left hemisphere mode of apprehension relates to the right hemisphere mode of comprehension. It's very interesting. I'll send you just a page.
Coleridge would be delighted to know that, because towards the end of his life, he was trying to engage with scientists and trying to produce, you know, if I could borrow in advance a phrase of Rupert Sheldrake's, a kind of new science of life. He was trying to think about nature as a whole, including, you know, both the imagination and what the imagination apprehends. And he was very interested, therefore, in the physicality as well as the spirituality of our being, and how
so important. Yes.
You know, so in advance of his time, Coleridge is astonishing. Really. It's kind of
Yes, no, quite. Mind you, I mean, I don't know how much he did actually borrow direct from Schelling, but he did learn from Schelling and other German
yes.
poets of the same
Yeah,
era.
yeah.
But I mean, I was brought up on the idea that he literally stole a hook, line, and sinker from Schelling in translation, and I think there are passages in which he does that.
Yeah. I mean, he did translate a lot, and he often in his notebooks
Yes.
simply wrote down large bits of Schelling, and so there may be a situation in which sometimes he had so integrated Schelling, Fichte hours into his own thought that he could no longer distinguish.
No.
What he,
Well, I think that's entirely fair, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it sort of reminds me of, was it Auden who said, immature poets imitate, mature poets steal.
Yeah, that's right.
And they don't do knowingly, but things that they have read somewhere come up in their mind and find a new home. They're given a local habitation and a name.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, anyway, I rather like Coleridge's response to those accusations of plagiarism that came into him later in his life, when people, largely as a result of his own efforts, started reading these German philosophers and saying, "Oh, it's been
Yes, quite."
And one of Coleridge's responses is brilliant. He said this. He said, "Truth is the divine ventriloquist. It doesn't matter which of us dummies he speaks through."
Yes, that's lovely, isn't it?
I mean, there's something I don't know quite how to put this, but in Coleridge's distinction between fancy and imagination, it seems to me a very helpful one, and is certainly true. But it's always seemed to me there's something that isn't quite captured in that, which he expresses very well in The Ancient Mariner, actually, which is the way that imagination, I mean, it's one of the other sort of traps of imagination, that it can actually become a kind of poisoned, which is what sort of happens in The Ancient Mariner with this sort of horrible vision of nature. It just seems to me that, I mean, the fantasy, you might say that, but it doesn't quite sort of get to it. I mean, what's always, there's a wonderful sort of Hebrew word, yatsar, which really just means forming and sort of making, and it's the word that's used as a potter, yatsir. But it's also it's used in the kind of the Genesis mythos. It's the word that's used first of all to describe God making Adam from the ground, and it's used again for making the soul in man and so on. But then when it's applied, it's then in the next chapters it's applied to human beings, and it's now they have this forming capacity but then, which becomes after the kind of fracture, it's the imagination of man is evil from his youth, and it goes, and so that then you kind of need this sense of the redemption of the imagination, that somehow our imaginations need to be reformed, and that seems to me what is happening in The Ancient Mariner, where you have the water snakes of the horrible slimy things, and then suddenly they're transformed by his vision.
And the vision is under moonlight. That's what causes it. I mean, you're right. One of the most tremendous things in that poem is the movement from when he's in a state of utter anomie and self-disgust and isolation. He sees the water snakes and he says, 1,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I. But then the moving moon went up the sky and nowhere did abide. And when he sees them, I mean, in the poem, literally in a new light, but obviously in its deepest meaning, metaphorically in a new light, he suddenly says, "Oh, happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware." So the thing that happens is the renewal of something in the heart. And obviously heart and head language could also map onto the other things. But I always relate that when he's in his worst state and he tries to pray but can't, so he's in a state of utter isolation from what animates and is living around him, but also from God. So in that earlier state, he says, "I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but wherever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came, and made my heart as dry as dust. Now, I think that's a deliberate looking back to the Genesis narrative, and it's an unmaking of his humanity. It's the molded clay, the formed thing being reduced again to dust. And the redemption of vision reverses that. A spring of love gushed, the very same word, a spring of love gushed from my heart, and I bless them unaware. He has to be me, he has himself to be remade at the deepest level in order to see aright. And yet seeing aright is also what blesses him. You know, that then becomes a circular thing, and his, if you like, his holistic vision is restored. I mean, one of the things I say, I mean, perhaps contentiously, I don't know, or controversially in that book, is that not simply that, in a sense, he mapped his own life before it happened, but I think he foresaw an arc as yet unrealized of our cultural history. I think he saw us on the voyage towards that place of utter anomie, in which everything is just a, you know, as he put it in one of his letters, an immense heap of little things, which we then despise. And I think we're just now, and partly through Iain's work and the work of others now, beginning to turn and try precisely to bring the right brain back in, not to undo or overwrite the left, but to finally make some sense of it in a wider sense. And I think that's what the Mariner does. I think I mean, he calls the imagination at one point in the Biographia Literaria the sacred power of self-intuition, and he uses this extraordinarily particular and minute metaphor or analogy drawn from nature. He talks about the chrysalis of the horned fly, and while it's still in this squishy pupa state, it says it creates this chrysalis into which it will grow. I think Coleridge's exact words are, it leaves room in its involucrum for antennae yet to come. And one of the things I think the great works of the artistic imagination can do for us as scientists as much as anything else, is to imagine for us the shape of a vision or a model of the world into which our antennae, our actual, you know, particularly perceiving an instrumental way of things, into which it can grow. But it can't grow unless, as it were, the shape has already been sketched out and the space is held open for it. That's what a chrysalis does, is it holds open a space into which you grow.
That seems to me, I'm not much of a poet, so you could tell me, Malcolm, but that seems to me to accord with my experience of trying to write poetry, which is that there is a shape or form that is in your mind, a feeling about the shape of something, and that it only becomes clear as the words start to sort of come into it. Yeah. So it is a creative space, and the really key thing is not to try and collapse it into specificity and clarity too early, but to sit uncomfortably with that unknowing, you know, the deliberate unknowing while the thing comes into being.
Absolutely.
I think also that to go back to the blessing of the snakes. And to what Roger was saying about the imagination and that it can sometimes be quite dark in an unpleasant way. I don't think there's anything about the imagination that says it's always got to be go to pleasant and comfortable places. It takes us to all sorts of places, and some of those are perfectly real. And I suppose as a psychiatrist, what I would say is a lot of the things that I found were important, but to get people to accept what Jung called the dark side or the shadow, and that this is part of us, and that accepting it is healthful, healing, and creative. And that's really what I think that passage describes.
Yeah, and it's about making a transition from the one to the other. I think one of the most wonderful moments in Paradise Lost is the opening invocation of light in book 3.
Indeed.
Which Milton, of course, is blind and he's talking about light. So there's all kinds of poignancy there. But he talks about, he's just written the first 2 books are about hell and in hell. And they're an extraordinary imagination of everything you can think of that you mean by hell. And what it might be to be the kind of being who says better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But when he comes to the invocation of, now he's going to try and describe heaven, he says, he asked the spirit that taught my muse to venture down the dark descent and up to reascend, though hard and rare. So he recognizes that the same muse which took him down now has to bring him up. But he's unapologetic about venturing down the dark descent and up to reascend. I think he may also be echoing a bit of Virgil there in Aeneas 6, where of course Aeneas has to descend, and he opens up the question, if I go down, how do I get up? You know, I'm not going down just in order to be down. So going back to the darkened imagination, I think there's a distinction between the artists who need to go down into those dark and terrible places, but in order to bring about a reintegration that's credible, you know, like Karl Barth says about Mozart's music, that we accept the yes in it because it contains and overcomes a no. But there are people, for whatever reason, wherever they're in life, who want to venture down the dark descent, but don't want to reascend. And they don't want you to reascend with them either. So, I mean, in his younger days, Dylan put his finger on that when he says, one who sings with his tongue on fire, bent out of shape by society's plier, cares not to come up any higher, but rather gets you down to the hole that he's in. Now, you know, it's all right, Mara, if I can't.
Yeah.
So I think we have to distinguish between a whole work, which includes both descent and reascent, and a fragmented work, which, is, if you like, capitulates to despair and doesn't allow for a completion.
To put Barth's observation another way, the only kind of yes that means anything is one that has fully faced the no. Yeah. Knows what that is and is able to transcend it, and the same is true the other way around. So, you know, the no needs also to be aware of the yes. Yeah. The negative and the positive are parts of one another, and you can't have one without the other, without robbing things of their meaning.
Yeah, no, and obviously it's very hard to make a judgment where people. I mean, I've heard people talk about Beckett, and particularly some of the Beckett novels, as though they were only a no. I'm not persuaded, actually. I mean, even the very end of The Unnameable, which is extraordinary. I mean, I remember Christopher Ricks once saying to me, the unnameable comes quite close to being the unreadable. And it's true to some degree. But if you do go on, even in the agony of it at the end, you know, the famous last lines, I can't go on, I'll go on. Yes, I'm finishing, yes. I'll go on.
Yes.
I mean, you have Iain in your, well, both in your The Master and His Emissary and in the new book, you talk quite a bit about schizophrenia and the kind of vision of the world that gives, and you talk about a remarkable book by which I have yet to read, but very much want to, by Louis Sass, Modernism and Schizophrenia.
Oh yes,
which seemed to have this idea of the. I mean, at first when I read that, I have to admit I was a bit sort of skeptical, because it just seemed, you know, it could be, you could use that as a way of sort of beating modernism over the head by saying it's schizophrenic, but that's not, I think, what either he or you are saying at all, but rather there's a kind of fragmented view of the world, which seems to be very much a feature of schizophrenia, is also something that is reflected in quite a lot of modernist literature and painting and art, and that it's quite hard to know exactly what to make of that, really, but it does seem to be very, very clearly the case.
Well, you're quite right that there's no suggestion that this is a way of simply rubbishing modern art. Great artists will survive whatever the milieu in which they paint or write is, but nonetheless they can't avoid reflecting something of the milieu out of which they arise, even if they do so by rebelling against it, because that will also be part of the culture out of which they come. So it's hardly surprising that in the 20th century you see elements in art and in I don't just mean visual art, but Louis Sass in that book Madness and Modernism writes about the whole range. Of the subtitle is art literature, madness in art, literature, and insanity in the light of art, literature, and thought. And so he's looking at the whole gamut and finds something like 20 to 25 different parallels between phenomena that are recognized in people suffering from schizophrenia and modernist art. So it is something absolutely fascinating, and it is a book well worth reading. It's a very beautifully written book by a man who is a very broad range of reference, and I think it's completely compelling. And it changed the way in which I was thinking about the hemisphere thing, because of course we couldn't be all suddenly developing schizophrenia in the 20th century. What I think it showed was that we were neglecting the aspect of reality that's revealed to us by our right hemispheres. And this is very like the condition of schizophrenia, in which there is a sort of left hemisphere hyperactivity or overdrive, and a hypoactivity or underperformance, underfunctioning, hypofunctioning of the right hemisphere. So there we are. But you're quite right. I mean, other people have noticed it since. I'm very glad to say. So I'm not alone, as it were, in noticing this. But thank you for alerting everyone to the idea that this is not a way of disparaging modern art as such, although it does draw attention to some of the limitations under which for quite a long time it labored.
Yes.
Just talking about this, I perhaps it's slightly late to throw it into the conversation going back, but I just thought, because it seems to be so seminal, it might be worth just hearing again the sentence from Coleridge in which he talks about what the imagination does, and he lists, I think this may have been one of the ones you had in mind, Iain, where he felt the things he listed were so close to the way the left and the right work. But this might also be about what an artist does, even in this whole question of modernism. So he says, this is what he says about the secondary imagination, differing only in the kind of its own degree from the primary. He says, it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates, that's, if you like, one thing, in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize, to unify. It is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So it's, and it seems to me we're in a transition from precisely the kind of fixed and dead and the dissolving, and we're only just beginning to attempt again in our culture to reunify, to recreate.
Yes, in the notebooks he writes, I was just looking this up now, this power, which is the imagination, reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order. And I then go on to show how this is a perfect example of the union of what both right and left hemispheres give. Although I ought to point out that the right hemisphere, in any case, tends to carry out this unification of what it knows with the left, whereas the left remains defiantly separate.
All right. Well,
in a way, sort of Coleridge's, biographical literary is itself a kind of example of this, and it has these dense sort of philosophical passages, but it integrates all this with his own life and with his discussions of Wordsworth, and the whole thing is part of a whole life. And I mean, Iain, you were talking earlier about your book Against Criticism, which is, I think all three of us were sort of studied English literature at a time when there was a kind of a rather abstracted kind of view of how you had to do this, and sort of structuralism and so on.
Yes.
But really, I mean, Malcolm's study of Coleridge is very much shows that there is a different way of approaching literature, and I think
Absolutely.
do you think there is a more constructive way we can actually talk? And last time we talked, we were talking about labeling pictures being such a sort of unpleasant thing as well. But do you think there is I mean, Malcolm has quite an optimistic view that we might actually bring things together. I mean, do you share that at all?
Yes, I think that the sin of our age is dogma in science, dogma in the arts. And when I was studying literature, dogma in literature, dogma always narrows the mind and stops one seeing things that are both true at the same time, but according to one part of one's mind can't be. One's got to be one or the other. But actually holding things together in suspension is very important. And I suppose I was lucky enough to be taught by John Bailey, who was completely opposed to any of the current isms of the age. And I think that what we may now be seeing is the breakdown of these rather narrow lenses, because once you apply a certain ism to literature, you have utterly restricted it, and you've replaced it with something of your own imagining, which is very much less. So what I'm worried about now is people in universities being forced to subject the great works of literature of the past to a colonialist critique or a feminist critique or whatever it is, which will only reveal how superior they are to somebody in the past, won't allow them to contact the riches of what they're seeing.
I totally agree with that. And I think these systems, when they become very rigid, you can already predict the result they're going to get. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
So you must.
For that reason, it's not an education; it's an indoctrination.
Exactly. So there's a wonderful little line, throwaway line. There's an interesting. I mean, he's died now. Chinese essayist and translator Lin Yutang. I mean, he translated a lot of the Chinese.
Yes.
But he wrote one of my favorite books of all time. It's just been a key book for me since I was in my late teens. He wrote a little book called The Importance of Living, which is really a lovely series of familiar essays. But in one of those essays, he's talking about the difference between Chinese and Western thought. But at one point he says, every system of thought is a squint at the truth. And the more rigid the system, the worse the squint.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That's just so right. What I love is the Chinese insistence on the method of no method, because that's the only way in which you can allow the thing to live. Your method that you suppose and prejudge things by will simply produce a Procrustean image with the feet and the head chopped off.
No, that's very, very true. I mean, no system. The great Chinese, phrase "wu wei" is doing nothing.
Yes,
I would love to, if I could go back in the past and have a conversation with somebody. One of the things I would do is I'd try to have a conversation with Keats, because Keats' account in his letter of what he calls negative capability, which is famously awareness of everything, but a refusal to impose yourself on them, which he thought Shakespeare had supremely, and he tried to cultivate himself. That seems to me very close to Wu Wei,
It is. It is. Interesting, when I was writing against criticism, I was sitting at lunch one day with David Hawkes, who was a very great sinologist, and I was trying to explain to him that the things I wanted to say in my book against criticism didn't seem to be easy to articulate in English. Why is the implicit so much more important than the explicit? Why is the whole not achieved by the summing the parts? Why is the unique something that language completely refuses to be able to respect? And he said, in Chinese, there are terms for all of this. And at that stage, I had to decide whether to become a sinologist or a doctor. And I'm afraid I became a medical doctor.
Well, we're glad
there's some great sinologists out there, so we can.
I had this experience a couple of the other year. I was going to an exhibition of students' work And it was actually some lovely work, but students now in art schools are sort of told to explain their work. They have to stand in front of it and give these sort of explanations. And he was actually a Chinese, a wonderful kind of, and he'd mastered all the glorious sort of techniques of Chinese sort of painting and used them, bringing in, with the Western ways of seeing as well. And he'd done this really lovely picture, and he was standing in front of it, and I was looking at the picture, and he was doing what he was being told to do, and he was giving me this absolutely sort of banal sort of art speak explanation of the thing, whilst behind him the picture was singing its heart out, and I just wanted to tell him to be quiet and let the picture sing, but
the work of art is its own best expression, and this business of trying to reduce it all to a statement, if it had been reducible to a statement, there'd be no point in creating the work of art in the first place.
Oh, I absolutely. My experience in trying to write poetry is very much that if I know before I write the poem what it's going to be, what's in it, and that turns out to be the case, then it is not a poem; it's a note to self. And basically, what I'm waiting for when I write is like the quickening kick in the babe in the womb, or the pulse of the fish out of the water. I want something that resists what I was about to do to it and says, no, write me like this. Then I know I've got something. And paradoxically, I know I've got something when I don't know what it is. And I haven't got something when I do know what it is.
Yes.
No, that's very, very lovely. It's very good. And it's like Pushkin's remark at the end of Yevgeny Onegin that, at the outset, he had no idea where this path was going to lead. And I really believe he didn't. And yet the whole thing came into being. It's slightly like, in reference to Wu Wei, the sage does nothing, but nothing is left undone. So that by the not knowing and the not doing, the thing is allowed to come into being. Yeah. It's what I call active passivity, a sort of renunciation, or, Malcolm, kenosis.
Absolutely.
This might be rather a good time to actually have a poem. And I don't know, Malcolm, if you might read us your wonderful villanelle on the
I regret to say this is a true story, in the sense that I was supposed to be giving a talk on poetry illustrated by some of my poems, and I had not got the handouts adequately done, and I thought, I only had 5 minutes before the lecture, and I thought there'll be a photocopying room and there'll be a photocopier. And of course, in my young day, a photocopier was a really simple thing where you just put something on the top, and there was one button on it which helpfully said copy. And I went into this room. There's this huge machine. You couldn't even tell which was the front or the back. All these trays out. So I said to a friend, it's more like a Hindu god than a